he wanted to be the expert, and he got treated like the expert. And the problem was, like everyone, he didn't have all the information and didn't wait, to see how things were actually playing out. Instead, he's all confidence and very little understanding.
I just sat down with Dr. Ryan Yonk from AIR, who is the Director of Public Choice and Public Policy Project. So we discussed Fauci's exodus from his lofty heights. And I think that you'll find this discussion quite interesting through the lens of public choice. What incentives does Fauci have to leave? What incentives did he have to do what he did while he was working in government? And how he was the bureaucrat of bureaucrats.
Yeah, so he's been working in the federal government for right around 60% of his adult life. So he entered the bureaucracy as a young man and is leaving the bureaucracy as an old man. And so he's become sort of the quintessential Hayekian man of system. And there are few people that understand the bureaucracy and how to play within it and get what you want more than Dr. Fauci does.
Can you explain this Hayek position?
Yeah, well, so Hayek is the idea that when you set up systems and you have plans, people will start to operate within those systems. They'll respond to incentives just like we would always expect people to do, but they become sort of written into the overall system itself. And so most of the behavior that we saw from Dr. Fauci isn't a surprise to anyone who understands some basic public choice theory, some basics about the U.S. federal bureaucracy, and the incentives that people face when they're at the highest levels of leadership within that bureaucracy. We don't have to like it, but it's the reality.
So I would love to get into those incentives, but first I would like to ask you, why do you think that he retired now?
Yeah, so the question of why he retired now is a big one. I think there's probably a lot of different things going into it, but I suspect the biggest one is we're arriving at the end of the pandemic. There's not a lot of places to go from here. There's very little appetite among either the elected officials or the general public for increased intervention at a high level. And in many ways, it's the end of a very long career. And at the moment, as he likes to explain over and over again, that he inspires people to go into medicine. And as much as it's terrifying to hear people talk about themselves that way, fundamentally, he's not necessarily wrong. I think he's leaving at the very height of his level of influence and his level of power, and is leaving in a way that's probably going to give him the most options once he's out of office.
That makes sense. On the flip side, though, there are people like Rand Paul who have challenged him. I think this was a few months ago, and said you need to resign because of your connections with the Wuhan lab and things like that. Do you think that could be part of it too?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that there is nothing more that Dr. Fauci loves than sparring with Rand Paul. If you watch him in the hearings that was held before the U.S. Congress, and this is, I think, one of the things that politicians often forget about bureaucrats, is they fall really into two categories. One, they're either convinced that they have to do whatever the politicos say, or two, they understand the system they exist in and recognize that as civil service employees, whether or not that politician gets reelected in the next time he's up or she's up, or whether or not the control of Congress changes, the worst they can really do to Dr. Fauci is summon him and yell at him on the floor, on the committee room floor. And at the end of the day, Dr. Fauci was going to stay in the leadership, in the bureaucracy, until he decided to leave under his own power. And that's exactly what we saw happen. So maybe he's tired of dealing with folks with the questions from folks like Rand Paul. I think those are appropriate questions. I think they're important questions, because we've seen lots of behavior from the bureaucracy that's concerning, to say the very least, during the pandemic. But I doubt it's what motivated him to decide to leave office.
Okay, so why do you think that bureaucrats become so untouchable? Is that because of the system, as you were saying earlier?
Yeah, it's a direct result. I think it's a direct response to the civil service system, which is designed specifically to insulate bureaucrats from the political side of the government. Civil service comes about in the late 19th century in response to the cronyism and the appointing of people's friends to high office, and really, is a response of the progressive era to try to professionalize government. And on the one hand, they do that. They do change a bunch of that, but they create a whole host of different problems where unelected bureaucrats end up responding to very different incentives than those who run for office have to respond to.
Yeah. So for Fauci himself, what do you think were the biggest incentives that were driving him, like through this last COVID period, but as well as, his whole career?
Yeah, so I think Anthony Fauci is the bureaucrat's bureaucrat in many ways. So you don't end up, as I said, being at the height of the agency for so many years. He's been a senior advisor on public health for at least 38 years to presidents going back as far as Ronald Reagan, without learning to play the game and responding to the incentives that are in front of them. And those incentives are the same as virtually any other bureaucrat: maximizing budgets, maximizing power and influence, capturing the ability to regulate and make decisions. And across all of that, we've seen Fauci's career play out in he's really the textbook example of the bureaucrat's bureaucrat. And I should say, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to see nefarious motives in order for a bureaucrat to play that game and play it the way Anthony Fauci has. And in fact, I think in his own mind, he probably thinks he's doing good for the world, but he's playing with very different incentives.
Yeah, well, if you actually have seen the trailer for the movie that came out about Fauci, like, you could see that he thinks that he's doing good. So I don't know if you've seen that, but it's pretty clear how he thinks of himself.
Yeah. So when he talks about himself, he clearly is framing it as somebody who is merely just doing good. And it's the merely, I think, that's important for us to focus on, because bureaucrats, simply because they decide to work in an agency where they think they're doing good, don't lose all of their own self-interest, their own preferences, or stop facing the incentives that the rest of us face. Those things are all very much in play, and we can watch Fauci respond to them. If you look at the evolution just in the COVID pandemic, in how he talked about it, how he responded to it, depending on who was in power, what public opinion was, you watched Anthony Fauci turn himself in knots and twist himself up as he tried to respond. And ultimately, we've heard a lot of double talk from Dr. Fauci, but the sort of double talk that you would exactly expect from a bureaucrat who's attempting to make sure he stays in power and that he remains influential and his agency remains really in charge at the table. And his time with in the Trump White House, working with others on the pandemic, you watched Dr. Fauci do just that. And when that didn't work, he went to the media directly. He spoke directly to the American people and tried to convince them that he was the bastion of integrity and the only place where good decisions could come from. And played it pretty masterfully through most of the pandemic until people decided they were done with the heavy restrictions and really started to doubt that most of what he was demanding was working. But you also watched him pivot as soon as that was true to a whole new set of recommendations.
So this is a good time maybe to bring up something that maybe our viewers don't know about, and I don't think has been covered very much by media. But there was that redacted email that came out, or a series of emails from him and Francis Collins, who was the director of the NIH at the time, where they wanted a quick and devastating takedown of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was hosted by AIER at the time, right? And they basically were saying, we think lockdowns will be more destructive, we want focused protection, and they had an alternative, more of the typical way you would have dealt with a pandemic pre-COVID. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what's really interesting about the Great Barrington Declaration, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but in response to it, I spent a lot of time reading the very basics, and most of the Great Barrington Declaration reads like an early public health textbook on what you should do in response to a pandemic, and in fact, it looked like most of the plans that the government had created over the years in response to pandemics. But their cardinal sin was going against the ascendant sort of power of both the NIH, the CDC, and Dr. Fauci in particular, who were making arguments that went counter to those things and were attempting to put into place much wider influence for public health than had traditionally been done. And so, not surprisingly, anything that threatens that is likely to be pushed back against hard. And the redacted emails, so I was involved in getting some of those redacted emails, partly because I'm always fascinated by what's going on behind the scenes in government agencies during these sorts of things, pretty clearly show that there was a coordinated effort to protect turf, to prevent anyone else from engaging in the process that might have a different opinion or suggest a different path, and a real push to make sure that there were no alternative narratives out there, either in the press or being generally talked about by the administration at the time.
Well, the success of that is very, very clear.
Yeah, no, they clearly, their actions clearly worked over the short run. Over the long run, I think it's been far less successful, partly because we've now come around essentially to the same principles that were in the Great Barrington Declaration and in virtually every sort of textbook pandemic response kit, of quarantines not being likely to work, large-scale ones, that lockdowns are likely to be ineffective and probably do more harm than damage, and that you should identify those who are at greatest risk and figure out if there are ways to protect them, all of which are sort of the common sense responses to the pandemic. And we've now watched that play out over time to become, in the last couple of weeks, the official CDC position as the world has changed. And one of the things you'll notice is Dr. Fauci adapted right along with those things once it became clear that he was no longer able to maintain the position he had and still continue to be the primary person where people were getting their information and having influence. And that's what I mean by the bureaucrat's bureaucrat. This is what bureaucrats do. They seek to maximize their agency's influence, their own personal influence, as well as the resources they have to operate in. Usually because they believe in the mission of the place they work. Doesn't sound great, because it isn't, but it also is pretty easy to understand when you think about who ends up working at places like the NIH or the CDC. They're working there because they have a deep and abiding belief in the work they do, and they will find a way to use the system to get their preferences achieved. The rest of us just have to pay for it.
Well, that makes sense. When you think about anybody else who's an employee and how they go about, or, a high-level employee, they kind of do the same thing. If they believe in the mission of wherever they work, they will do everything to kind of support that mission.
Yeah, and you add one additional level to all this, and that is their own personal incentives. It's clear Dr. Fauci likes being the source of where people go for integrity and the science, and very much enjoys playing that role. And that's a role he's cultivated and attempted to be in for years. This is not the first time we've seen Dr. Fauci engage in these public health discussions. This time he was way more successful than his earlier sort of stint responding to the AIDS epidemic, where it didn't quite work out the same way. And Dr. Fauci was pretty heavily vilified for his actions during that epidemic that really created, in many ways, the notion that HIV and AIDS was spread through household contact, raised that in the press, and created not a small bit of hysteria. Now, he wanted to be the expert, and he got treated like the expert. And the problem was, like everyone, he didn't have all the information and didn't wait, to see how things were actually playing out. Instead, he's all confidence and very little understanding.
Sounds kind of like Chicken Little. The sky is falling.
Well, it's the standard public health narrative. They're focused very much on public health and how their agencies can combat this one part of the experience that we are having usually without thinking about any of the other parts. No real consideration of the economic impacts, no real consideration of the impacts that isolation would have on children. All those things were in the back seat throughout most of the pandemic because public health was firmly driving, in no small part due to Anthony Fauci's work. Yeah. So I'm not particularly sad that he retired today. I'm always happy when a long-term bureaucrat leaves the federal government, but I can't say that he'll be missed. At least not by me.
Do you think that, I'm sure there are many people who feel the same way. Do you think that this will continue on this way, though, that this structure now has reached a level where there's much more power, there's much more authority and decision making? Like, will that stay there as part of his legacy?
Well, that would be the likely prediction, depending on who takes over after his retirement. But by the same token, you'll notice that the bureaucracy, it isn't just public health bureaucracy that exists in the federal government. You have lots of different agencies that are all jockeying for influence and resources and personal prestige. So will this particular agency remain ascendant? It seems unlikely. And the larger story here isn't that Dr. Fauci became incredibly famous and is being fawned over in his retirement and declared that he was the source of science.
Yeah.
Instead, what we should be focused on is the fact that government agencies and bureaucracies are able to garner this much power and influence and materially affect what goes on in people's daily lives, often with little legislative oversight or debate and discussion. And in fact, most bureaucrats prefer it when there isn't lots of debate and discussion, because debate and discussion make their jobs way harder.
So why do you think most people choose to be bureaucrats?
Well, so I think most people decide to be bureaucrats because they want to do good in the world. And they look at it and see, particularly in places like the NIH or the CDC or the EPA or the Bureau of Land Management, all those agencies that have a mission. They go in because they believe in the mission, and they think that mission is among the most important things that need to be done. So they go in with that firm belief. And then they become part of the larger system and figure out ways to achieve their preferences, which are usually in line with the mission, to advance their own careers by playing the game. And that game, laid out in a bureaucracy, becomes how decisions get made and how we get so far down a path of things happened in the pandemic with very little debate and oversight, and it simply becomes the new normal. So most bureaucrats, especially those that work in these sorts of agencies, I think enter with the best of intentions and then quickly become sole-minded on what they're trying to do and will play any set of games necessary within the system to try to achieve what they want.
And then also, as you mentioned, to kind of change the system at the same time and change the rules and alter things, right, in order to get further, get what they want.
Oh yeah, no. Part of what happens in a bureaucratic system is you figure out what the rules are, and you figure out how the rules get made, and then you can identify how, by changing this part of the rules, you could get more of what you want, and you could have more resources, and so you work to do exactly that.
So what is next for Fauci? Where do you think that he'll go?
Well, I mean, who knows where an 81-year-old man will go after he retires from a very long career in government. But like most senior folks leaving this type of job, I would expect that he writes a book of some sort. I'd expect that he might join some corporate boards, probably get involved with nonprofits. I don't know exactly where he'll go, but he's going to go somewhere, and it's highly unlikely that he simply rides off into the sunset and we hear nothing else from Anthony Fauci. Instead, all of the things he's done over his whole career, and especially in the last 3 years, suggest we're going to hear more from him. The question is, what exactly does he do? And that, I think, is an open question that we'll learn way more about starting in January of 2023.
Well, I'm going to have to get some popcorn ready for that, because I'm sure it's going to be entertaining for us all, as long as it's, hopefully not going to be damaging as much as some of the decisions that he made at the helm of that organization. So,
yeah, at the very least, leaving government generally means that he'll have to at least convince some people that what he wants to do is right, whether it's convincing somebody to buy his book, convincing someone to fund a nonprofit he's involved with, or engage in or get put on corporate boards. Those are all things that, at least compared to leading a massive government bureaucracy, are all almost certainly improvements.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. Okay, well, that's great. I think that we've covered pretty much everything on this story. So, are there any last thoughts that you would like to leave our viewers with?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is goodbye, Anthony Fauci, and I won't miss you, but hopefully you'll go do something better for the next chapter.
And better for us all. Good riddance. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great, Ryan.